American University in Bulgaria.
I'm very pleased to welcome Theodora Dragostinova from Ohio State University. And before I introduce her, I would like to mention that this talk is being recorded by AUBG Talks, and you can watch it later on aubg.edu/talks. This is a wonderful student initiative we have here. So you'll be memorized. It's a yes, thank you. It's a wonderful database that we have. Theodora Dragostinova will be talking about culture for the masses, the contradictory logic of Bulgarian cultural diplomacy in the 1970s and 1980s. She's an assistant professor in history at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, where she teaches East European history, 20th century history, and Western civilization. She's author of a book titled Between Two Motherlands, Nationality and Migration among the Greeks in Bulgaria, and holds a PhD from the very well-known Urbana-Champaign University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a great center for Russian and East European studies. And she's a recipient of a number of awards, national awards, among which IREX, the Guggenheim Foundation, American Council for Learning Society. And this is actually the beginning of a book project with several cases, Bulgaria being one of the cases. Despite the modest audience, I hope that it would be a good way for you to get some good feedback, and that would help you further on your work with your project. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you so much, Emilia. Thank you for the generous introduction. It really is a pleasure being here because I'm very early in this project. That's actually my second presentation on this topic, and it's important to get some feedback early on so that you know that you're on the right track. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. What I want to focus on today in this talk is on an examination of Bulgarian cultural policies and practices abroad, internationally, in the late 1970s and 1980s, associated with the lavish celebration in 1981 of an important national anniversary, 1,300 years or 13 centuries since the establishment of the first Bulgarian state in 681, when the communist regime orchestrated a series of very extravagant events, both domestically and internationally, celebrating this occasion. Domestically, there were various events, including the building of important architectural markers that still stand or almost stand in the case of this monument here in the center of Sofia, throughout Bulgaria. Also various celebrations involving the population, the publishing of books, the making of movies, and so forth. So there was a very extensive domestic aspect of these celebrations. However, what I really want to talk about today is the international aspect of these celebrations, because the Jubilee, the celebration of this Jubilee, turned out to be a huge enterprise of Bulgarian cultural diplomacy across the globe. Now, the person behind these events was Ludmila Živkova, the daughter of the Bulgarian Communist Party leader and head of state Todor Živkov, who experienced a spectacular political career early on. She became a deputy minister of culture in 1971 at age 29, then a minister of culture in 1975, and a member of the Politburo of the Bulgarian Communist Party in 1979, until her death 2 years later, actually during the year of the anniversary. And together with her close associates, she embarked on a mission to create a new international image for Bulgaria, using this celebration as an occasion to stage a series of very ambitious cultural projects showcasing Bulgaria abroad. And the international aspect of these celebrations was really huge. And what I want to show you here is some pictures from a recent exhibition honoring the role of Ludmila Živkova in what was termed by the people who put the exhibition together the Bulgarian cultural opening abroad. I'm going to return to this term and I'm going to examine the validity of this term, but as you can see from these images, what you clearly see here, her meeting with world leaders, well, of course you have Brezhnev, but you also have Jimmy Carter, you have Indira Ghandi, you have a plethora of world leaders whom she got in contact with to organize these celebrations. Now, in addition to showcasing Bulgaria abroad, Ludmila Živkova also had ambitious plans to bring the world to Bulgaria. And just very briefly, she also organized a series of international events within Bulgaria. The most noted one was, of course, the World Assembly of Gifted Children, the Banner of Peace Assembly of Gifted Children, but also another series of events was international writers' meetings, various others international conferences of Bulgarian studies, and other international events bringing international audiences in Bulgaria as well. However, here my focus will be on the Bulgarian celebration of this anniversary of 13th century's Bulgaria abroad. And I will study these events from two different points of view. First of all, when I'm examining the official policies orchestrated by the communist regime, I'm looking at aspects of cultural diplomacy. What was the role of cultural diplomacy in disseminating, in creating a particular image for Bulgaria abroad? And why exactly did the people behind the celebrations choose to promote and advertise a particular image for Bulgaria during this time period? In addition to the official policies initiated by these communist elites, because there is no doubt that this wasn't some sort of like a spontaneous event happening from ordinary Bulgarians participating in these events, I also studied the reaction, the realization of these policies, the implementation of these policies, and the reaction of the audiences who came in contact with these Bulgarian policies. So I tried to study these events as part of the cultural Cold War. I tried to trace what happens to communist ideas when they cross borders, how they have to take on a new practical meaning in order to attract foreign audiences, how they change very frequently in the process of transmission abroad, because you cannot simply orchestrate cultural policies. You have to actually attract audiences, and in the process of organizing these events, very often the communist elites behind these events had to make important compromises with the ideological function of these events as they were first envisioned. So what I want to do is give you an overview of some of these events that occurred well, in selected areas across the globe. I'm not going to be comprehensive, but I do wish to demonstrate to you that according to the logic of Bulgarian cultural diplomacy, Bulgarian cultural events were not simply staged in the Soviet bloc, and many were. They didn't simply go to Western Europe and the United States, but actually there was a very expansive Bulgarian cultural diplomacy across the globe. It was truly a global affair, and this map from the late 1970s demonstrates the various places the Bulgarians staged these policies. So if you note the right corner on the top, this is the Soviet bloc where 7,000 plus events took place. However, if you pay attention what other parts of the world the Bulgarians went to, in Asia alone there were 15,000 plus cultural events staged, really showing the ambitious goals of these elites, which wanted to export Bulgarian culture not only to the east and to the west, but also to the developing world, to the third world, in order to expose these developing nations to the Bulgarian cultural policies as well. So it was truly a global project, and this is what the focus of my book project will be. When I examine these policies as they occurred from the mid-1970s on, I analyze them on 3 levels. The first level is the level of ideas, or the actual inspirations, the actual models, the actual ideological functions of these cultural practices. Why did the Bulgarians want to engage in this cultural diplomacy to begin with? Second, I examine the events at the level of practice, the actual staging of these events, the sites where the events occurred. So what happens to these ideas when they had to be implemented in practice? And finally, I also examine these policies, these cultural practices at the level of audience. In other words, how these ideas and practices were received, internalized, or understood by the participants in the events. So I'm trying to implement this 3-level analysis in order to show the richness of the outcomes of the Bulgarian cultural extravaganza abroad. So let me talk about ideology first. And this is sort of like the title of my presentation, Culture for the Masses, ? So according to the official ideologues of these Jubilee celebrations, and they wrote extensively about the ideological functions of these Jubilee. They published a variety of different texts that justified and explained these celebrations ideologically. They produced these sort of very complicated graphs showing the relationship between social, ideological, political, and financial effects, and how exactly you are able to achieve the maximum effect. So they were very much actually trying to comply with ideological doctrines as envisioned during late socialism. So what we see is that in this context, the ideological function of the celebrations had the dual purpose of showing socialist Bulgaria as the proud heir of a rich historical heritage, while also suggesting the inevitability and proximity of the communist future. And you can really see this tendency to link the past with the present in these sort of posters produced by the regime. You have the historical aspect, you have the column, Dacian column, on the background of this industrial scaffolding, right? You have 681, the anniversary leading to the bright communist future. So very definitely the element of ideology was there as part of the celebrations. However, ideology was not the only thing. What ultimately happened is that there were very pronounced national, if not nationalist features, of course, in these celebrations for sure. And I do want to show you some of the monuments that were built showcasing Bulgarian history, showcasing the antiquity of the Bulgarians, going back in the past and portraying Bulgaria as the proud heir of a glorious history that now has to be celebrated. So in addition to the ideological functions of these celebrations, you also have very pronounced national, if not nationalist functions. And here we really truly see the revival of nationalism in communist Bulgaria, which of course later on escalated during the revival process with the ethnic Turks and so forth. And in addition to these two aspects of the celebrations, finally we also have to consider the role of Ludmila Živkova, and in particular her fascination with Eastern philosophy, with mysticism, with yoga, with esoteric thinking, with theosophy and so forth. She was in frequent contact with Indira Ghandi. She traveled frequently to India. She consulted regularly with the Bulgarian clairvoyant Vanga. She supposedly also was in regular communication with various other thinkers following the Eastern tradition of meditation. So in addition to the standard Orthodox communist ideas, hers were universalist ideas focused on the principles of, for example, unity, creativity, beauty, on the multifaceted personality, on the need for aesthetic education. So in addition to ideology and the national ideas, you also have these more universal ideas, sometimes often inspired by Ludmila's personal fascination with Eastern philosophies. So you really see a blend of ideas coming together in the way these celebrations were conceived. Now, in addition to the ideas, when the Bulgarians started looking for models, for examples, for examples of foreign experiences, what you see is that they used a very, shall I say, eclectic samples of other countries who had organized other round anniversaries. So in the late 1970s, the Bulgarian Ministry of Culture, it was called the Committee of Culture, conducted a study of the international experiences with round anniversaries, which included some 57 countries. And just to give you an example of the diversity of their sample, those countries under the letter A included Australia, Austria, Albania, Algiers, Angola, Argentina, and Afghanistan. So you really see that when they're drawing examples, when they're looking for examples from other round anniversaries, they're not sticking just with the Soviet bloc, but they're looking for examples globally. And I do want to give you some sense of what ideas they ultimately adopted and where these ideas came from. What is curious is that nowhere in the correspondence discussing these foreign experiences did I find a parallel between what the Bulgarians would do with these celebrations and, for example, the Soviet experience, which may come as a shock. We might expect that the Bulgarians are, in fact, looking for the Soviet experience when they are conceiving their own celebrations, if these celebrations are going to have a pronounced ideological function. The closest that the Bulgarians came to some sort of Soviet bloc cooperation was their meticulous study of the experience of their Polish comrades. So Poland was one of the models that they studied very carefully. In 1966, Poland celebrated the millennium, the Polish millennium, that is 1,000 years since the christening of the Polish people, with very extensive celebrations within Poland, mass celebrations, celebrations involving the entire Polish population. And that model proved to be very attractive to the Bulgarians because they were looking to organize a mass event, including the broad masses of the Bulgarian people. They borrowed from the Poles, they studied meticulously. However, they were really careful because in the Polish case, there was a very pronounced religious message. Since the anniversary was the anniversary of the christening of the Polish people, well, the Polish Communist Party could not avoid the mention of the Catholic Church. And that was something that the Bulgarians wanted to avoid in their own celebrations. So even though they used some examples from the Polish celebrations, they were very careful, very selective what is actually going to work in the Bulgarian case. Curiously, another example of international celebrations that proved very helpful for the Bulgarians, and you're totally going to expect this, was the celebration in 1971 of the 25th 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Persian Empire in Iran, of all places. So what happens here is that the Bulgarians are sending their own experts in Iran to study how exactly the Iranians actually organize their own celebrations. And what the Bulgarians found very valuable in these particular celebrations is the fact that the Iranians pursued, in addition to the domestic celebrations, they pursued a very broad international agenda. They invited foreign guests, they recruited foreign tourists, especially for the anniversary celebrations. They established special anniversary committees consisting of foreign dignitaries, and this model was another inspiration for the Bulgarians when they conceived their own events not only as a domestic celebration, but also as an international affair. So this international aspect of the Iranian celebrations was decisive in the conceptualization of the Bulgarian celebrations as a global affair. And then finally, again, inconsistent with the ideological ideas behind the celebrations to begin with, was another example. The example of the US bicentennial. In 1976, the United States, prepared to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the American Revolution. And this is so timely for the Bulgarians because around this time, they're starting to conceive their own celebration. So they sent a number of cultural of experts in the United States to study the bicentennial and to decide what elements can be used in the Bulgarian case. What you see here is the spectacular celebrations in New York, right? You clearly see there the Statue of Culture, the Statue of Freedom. Right? Now, what is interesting is that whenever the Bulgarian experts go to the United States to study the US experience, they always criticize the Americans ideologically. All the reports that I have read talk about how the goal of these celebrations was, quote, to promote the further cementation of the United States as the main political, economic, ideological, and military center of the world capitalist system. So the criticism of the United States is always ideological. In addition, the Bulgarian experts declare that the American propaganda machine is not able to take the main ideas of the American Revolution, life, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness, and to elevate it into a slogan for the bicentennial, masking important human problems in contemporary American society. So they're always criticizing the Americans as they're writing these reports, but it's very clear that they're following very carefully what's happening during the bicentennial. And ultimately, one of the main ideas of the Bulgarians, the idea to organize so-called complex events, came from the American celebrations. The American celebrations were broad celebrations covering the entire country. They had an international component. They had an active state involvement. There was a national celebration committee established to coordinate these celebrations. And these were all elements incorporated in the Bulgarian program, even though that was never stated explicitly. However, it's very clear to me, just studying the reports of these experts, that they're really paying attention to what is happening in the United States and what ideas they can incorporate. And final idea that they decided to borrow from the American case is what they perceived as propaganda overdose. And this is exactly what they call it in their reports. Because the Americans went overboard ideologically, because the Americans overdid their propaganda, we are not going to do this in our case. We're going to mute our ideological message. We're going to scale down our propaganda because we don't want to do what the Americans did, this ideological overdose that they were criticizing the Americans throughout the process. So it's very curious to see that the main countries that gave ideas to the Bulgarians how to put these celebrations together were very eclectic. Poland, to some degree, Iran, and the United States. There were other cases, I don't have the time to discuss those, but these are the main models. Now, in addition to the model, there was also the counter model. In addition to how to stage a jubilee, the Bulgarians were also asking how not to stage a jubilee. And in this case, their counter model, their negative experience was the one in Romania. In 1980, the Ceausescu regime in America organized a huge celebration of the 2050th anniversary since the establishment of the Dacian state, which was seen as the precursor of the modern Romanian state. According to the Bulgarians, the Ceausescu regime, they actually kept mocking it as a fake anniversary that contradicts historical truth. They considered that the Romanians went overboard with nationalism and that they basically failed to create a legitimate image for their own celebrations. So that's another reason why the Bulgarians decided to also tone down their nationalistic message, because they decided that in the Romanian case that did not work. So you really see how the Bulgarians are very meticulously trying to study all of these foreign experiences in order to plan their own celebrations. Ultimately, what you see is that there was a very ambitious, I showed you this map before, sustained attempt to stage various cultural events abroad. According to this number, Bulgaria ultimately staged the spectacular number of 38,854 cultural events throughout the globe in the period between 1976 and 1981. I mean, you have to admit that this is a very ambitious number for a small country. There was the entire state machinery put its support behind the Jubilee events, providing infrastructure, personnel, and finances. There was a special national coordinating commission put together in order to organize these events, to put together a complex Jubilee program to celebrate the anniversary throughout the world. So that was really a massive program for global cultural penetration to showcase Bulgaria as an ancient world civilization and as a key member of the socialist community. Now, from these ideas, from these experiences, from these inspirations, I would like next to move to different geographical locations to examine how actually these ideas were implemented in different areas, not only different geographical areas, but different geopolitical areas, different ideological blocks, if you wish, by the Bulgarians. One may expect that Moscow and the Soviet bloc would emerge as the natural center of these celebrations. Ultimately, things were not that simple. In one early enthusiastic report from the late 1970s, one Bulgarian expert noted, quote, "The opportunities for staging this remarkable jubilee in the Soviet state are practically unlimited," end quote. However, in the Soviet Union, the 1300 years events occurred in a muted way, they were largely downplayed and largely in a fashion disconnected from the core message of the anniversary themes. Now, the Bulgarians walked really a very fine line, because a key component of the 1300 events was the emphasis on Bulgaria as the cradle of Slavic civilization, and especially as the birthplace of the Cyrillic alphabet and the Slavic written culture, undermining the importance of medieval Rus in the dissemination of Slavic civilization, or at least this is how it was perceived by key members of the Soviet Union. And for that reason, what we see is this national message, this nationalist message clearly irritated the Soviets, who silently distanced themselves from the Jubilee, giving a major shrug to the Bulgarians. Ludmila Živkova was regularly summoned to Moscow to explain the ideas behind the celebrations. She and the archives for those conversations I haven't been able to find so far, but the memoir literature suggests that very often she was scolded by the Soviet membership for the idiosyncratic ideas that she was trying to implement. And for that reason, in the Soviet Union, the Bulgarians tried to mute the national overtones of the events. And instead of celebrating Bulgarian history, they focused on the economic advantages of communism, on the major progress that Bulgaria has made today in the contemporary times on the cooperation with the Soviet Union and on the future promises of communism. So this was largely an ideological message. So rather than emphasizing the historical aspect of the celebrations in the Soviet Union, this is the only place that the Bulgarians actually emphasized the ideological aspect of these celebrations. The key events associated with celebrating this anniversary in the Soviet Union included the launching of basically what you see here, let me just see what it's called, the Intercosmos Bulgaria satellite by Bulgarian and Soviet specialists in 1981, and it did carry Bulgaria 1300 inscription right here. You can vaguely see it. So Intercosmos Bulgaria 1300. So this launching was dedicated to the anniversary, but that was as far as it went. In marking the anniversary as it is. There was a Congress of Bulgarian Studies organized in what's today Ukraine. There was some commemorative, currency issued, but that was it. It was done in a very pro forma, in a very muted way, largely following the ideological templates and not really innovating culturally in any way. And this was pretty much the case in the rest of the Soviet bloc, where most of the celebrations followed the well-established event of cooperation in the Soviet bloc and the bright future of communism. By contrast, it is very clear that it was the celebration of the anniversary in the West that generated most of the excitement, that led to cultural innovation, that led to novel forms of cultural exchange and produced some very impressive results as far as showcasing the image of Bulgaria abroad. Now, always, whenever the Bulgarian experts wished to justify these events that they wanted to carry out in the West, they always used the ideological language. They always insisted that these cultural events in the West will follow, quote, an uncompromising, coordinated ideological line that will contrast the cultural practices of the socialist community to those in the developed capitalist countries. So the idea was to showcase the superiority of socialist culture oriented towards the masses and to emphasize the elitism of Western culture. However, in practice, what ultimately happened is that despite these ideological cliches, whenever the Bulgarians went to the West, they ultimately downplayed their ideological messages. And they were truly excited about these new opportunities that emerged. In 1980, Bulgarian functionaries boasted, quote, there is hardly a world capital from Washington to London, from Paris to Tokyo, that has not been engaged in an exciting opportunity to experience the extraordinary traditions and accomplishments of our people in culture and art. And you will note here that the world capitals mentioned all are located in the developed capitalist countries. However, this is the pride of Bulgarian cultural diplomacy. This is the accomplishment that these cultural experts are really proud of. So the most important exhibitions, the most noted folk concerts, the most ambitious publishing enterprises took place in the West, broadly defined. Various exhibitions were staged, from the Thracian treasures to the medieval Bulgarian civilization to 1,000 years Bulgarian icons, from the treasures of the Rhea monastery toured the most prestigious Western museums, facilitating a process in which, quote, the world literally rediscovered the culture of old and new Bulgaria. By the early 1980s, Bulgaria had cultural agreements with 16 capitalist countries in Europe, with the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, and had managed to organize a very ambitious cultural program in all of these countries. So it was clear what the priority was. These new practices in the West, these new opportunities to showcase Bulgarian culture in the West. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail here because obviously there are specific things relevant to each of the cases. But I do want to also mention briefly that if in the West Bulgaria was trying to get rid of its own obscurity and create a new international image for the country, one place that it got very strong reactions, of course, was on the Balkan Peninsula among the neighbors. Of course, celebrating an important national anniversary touched a nerve among the neighbors of Bulgaria, who very often claimed the same history. That was particularly true with Yugoslavia. During this time period, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia were engaged in a new scholarly controversy over the Macedonian language. And then that whole issue became exacerbated during the touring of the Thracian treasures exhibit, because many of these Thracian treasures actually came from areas that were not currently in the boundaries of Bulgaria, starting important controversies with the neighbors. In addition, the Romanians were very suspicious of any attempt of the Bulgarians to stage national commemorations. Curiously enough, it was the Greeks who were most responsive. And actually, the Greeks staged the most ambitious commemorations of Bulgarian history, the most extensive commemorations. And with Turkey, there was a very ambivalent relationship. So as part of my broader study, I intend to look at those reactions. So it is very clear that the neighbors are watching carefully what's happening within Bulgaria. But in addition to going close to home, the Bulgarians also had larger ambitions. So I'm trying to decide on what case studies I'm going to use for my examination of the Bulgarian cultural policies in the developing world, in the non-aligned world. But the two cases that I cannot ignore are clearly India and Mexico, where the Bulgarians are pursuing very dynamic policies, including cultural policies. So this will be two other of my case studies, and I'm also working to narrow down an African example, because in Africa there is also a very curious attempt of the Bulgarians to show the third world how to build an alternative socialist system for the developing countries. So it truly was a very global attempt to disseminate these cultural ideas throughout the world. Now, in addition to the ideas, in addition to the practices, one final aspect of the way I study this cultural policy was also the interactions and the people involved in the events. And I do want to zoom in on the United States here, and to basically show you how there is a discrepancy between ideas, implementation, and interaction with the audiences that often produce very curious results. Now, ideology was always there when the United States spoke, when Bulgaria spoke about the United States. According to this chart from the late 1970s, this is how cultural interactions, cultural exchange, cultural cooperation between Bulgaria and the United States should be organized. According to this very complicated chart that cannot possibly produce, in my modest opinion, concrete cultural policies. It is so ideologically driven, it is so random, it has all of these ideological considerations, but this is what these cultural experts had to do in order to justify cultural expansion, cultural cooperation with the United States. However, when we look at what the Bulgarians actually did in the United States, you will see that they tried very systematically to move away from ideology to more universal values, to more historically grounded ideas, celebrating the rich Bulgarian heritage rather than the communist ideology or the contemporary situation in Bulgaria. The first sign of this, what was called in the language of the time, the Bulgarian cultural penetration, and this is the terminology used, was the organization in 1977 of the Thracian Treasures exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, which was considered to be a major accomplishment for the Bulgarians. This exhibition was there for 6 months and then went to Boston to the Museum of Fine Arts. It drew huge audiences. It had massive media coverage by the United States. It also drew some official visits from the State Department, so it was considered to be a huge accomplishment for the Bulgarians. Following this event, there was a series of other Bulgarian cultural events organized in the United States. In 1979, the folk ensemble Pirin toured the United States for 3 months. Huge concerts throughout the United States, including Carnegie Hall, including, I believe, they also performed in the Kennedy Center in DC. So, I mean, it was a hugely ambitious project. Bulgarian poetry was read in 1980 at the Library of Congress. I mean, there were various other reasons. Folk music performances were always some of the most important events organized by the Bulgarians. But what we see during this time period is a very expansive and very ambitious program to showcase Bulgaria abroad culturally. Yet, when we look at the responses of the US media, you very rarely see any mention of the fact that actually Bulgaria during this time period is communist, or any criticism of that. Really, the focus of the American media, of the US media during this time period, was on the universal values, on the historical significance, on the archaeological value, for example, of the Thracian treasures exhibit. There were very few negative media examples during this time period criticizing the regime. There was a rare New York Times article talking about Ludmila as the Bulgarian princess, but that's the extent of what I was able to find. Most of the coverage that you see was really focused on the historical and archaeological significance of what was shown by the Bulgarians, on the rich historical background of the Bulgarians, and so forth. So really you see this discrepancy once more between the ideological function of this event and the actual implementation in the United States. Now, celebrating the anniversary, the 1300 years Bulgaria anniversary in the United States was also very successful. Now, because the Bulgarians were unable to ultimately secure an official recognition from the State Department of this anniversary, they decided to focus their cultural contacts largely on academic institutions. So they very systematically pursued contacts with prestigious U.S. academic institutions, from University of Pittsburgh to Columbia to the Ohio State University. These were some institutions where they managed to organize very extensive contacts, various scholarly events, conferences, meetings of Bulgarian ethnic organizations, and so forth. And ultimately, it was these academic institutions that became the center of the celebrations, the laboratory of these celebrations. There was a week of Bulgarian culture in Pittsburgh. There was a major conference at Ohio State. You can see one here from Columbia University. And what you ultimately see, the one development that the Bulgarians were most proud of was their ability to put together a special committee, the National Jubilee Committee, consisting of important American politicians, public figures, writers, academics, and so forth. And if you look at the list of people on that list, you will see, for example, Senators Fulbright is on the list, Adlai Stevenson. You also see some famous American writers such as John Updike, Erskine Caldwell, William Styron are on the list, but also some of the key names of Balkan studies in the United States, from John Bell to James Clark to Philip Shashko to John Lampy. Some of these noted American Balkanists were all involved in the celebrations. Now, in addition to these more former events, what we see is that very often cultural contact occurred at the local level. And this is the final example that I'm going to give you. An example with New Lexington, Ohio, which is a town of 3,500 inhabitants located about an hour out of Columbus, Ohio, the capital of Ohio, which still bears this sign here, well, New Lexington, near the birthplace of Januarius MacGahan, champion of Bulgarian freedom. This photograph is from 2 years ago in 2012 when I visited New Lexington. Now, what is interesting is that New Lexington was the birthplace of MacGahan, known to the Bulgarians as MacGahan. And who is MacGahan? MacGahan was a United States journalist who traveled to the Bulgarian lands under Ottoman rule in 1876, just in time to record the infamous Batak massacre of 1876 during the April uprising, and to basically cover it in the British press and to help disseminate the cause of the Bulgarian national movement. MacGahan passed away in Istanbul, then, well, in the Ottoman Empire, still in Turkey, I guess. And his body was brought back to New Lexington in 1883. And this is the original grave right here, where he was buried. Later on, in 1911, a group of local inhabitants built a second monument, which you can see right here, commemorating his work and commemorating his achievement as a noted local inhabitant of New Lexington. Now, in 1978 was the centennial of the death of MacGahan. And the Ohio legislature actually passed a special resolution declaring a 1 week in June as the official week of MacGahan. Right, the week dedicated to MacGahan. So, and there were big celebrations in New Lexington during that week. This is the picture of the celebrations, and during these celebrations, the Bulgarians showed up. Official representatives of communist Bulgaria who came to the cemetery in New Lexington and who offered as a gift to the American people a replica, a copy of the statue in Batak in Bulgaria. This is the folk dancing during the events. This statue, currently still located in Batak in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian communist representatives offered to make this gift to the inhabitants of New Lexington. And in fact, they did. And this copy of this statue is currently located next to the original gravestone and the 1911 monument. You also have this replica donated by communist Bulgaria to the inhabitants of New Lexington. Well, guess what? When that happened, members of the anti-communist political émigrés in Ohio decided that this is a total disgrace because this is clearly the propaganda machine of communist Bulgaria. And they decided that they had to respond in a proper way. What they did is that they approached a recent Bulgarian political émigré who had defected from Bulgaria that same year, 1978, during an exhibition in Vienna, who had immigrated to the United States and who was currently living in Cleveland, Ohio. His name, Lubomir Dalchev, the noted Bulgarian sculptor and actually brother of the noted Bulgarian poet Atanas Dalchev, whom they commissioned to make a second monument to MacGahan, which then they placed across from City Hall in downtown New Lexington. So in the course of 2 years, New Lexington, Ohio acquired 2 statues donated by various groups of Bulgarians who were basically rivals in this controversy over the legitimacy of the historical message that Bulgaria should send to the inhabitants of New Lexington. And ever since then, what you see is this peculiar gathering that occurred every year in New Lexington, bringing together the official representatives of communist Bulgaria, the anti-communist émigrés, usually a Bulgarian priest came either from Chicago or Cleveland or a nearby location, and all of these groups were forced into conversation, trying to talk and trying to mediate their own understanding of what they were trying to do here to promote the Bulgarian cultural image. Of course, what you ultimately see is that the audience of the many of these cultural events that Bulgarians organized were the émigrés, were the members of the Bulgarian immigrant communities in the United States. Some of these émigrés were loyal. They were those who showed up. They were those who were excited to be part of these celebrations because these celebrations helped them rediscover their roots and connect to their past in a way that they had never seen before. There were very rarely any other Bulgarian events before the mid-1970s. Now you have this cultural offensive almost. For them, that was an exciting opportunity. However, other émigrés reacted very strongly against these events, which they saw as the propaganda machine of communist Bulgaria. So one example is a magazine published in Chicago. The magazine is called Borba. It was published by a Bulgarian anti-communist émigrés in Bulgarian, and you can very clearly see the contrast that they try to portray. This is communist Bulgaria, this is the United States. And the entire message was anti-communist. They were trying to attack the legitimacy of the cultural events organized by the official representatives of Bulgaria. They staged their own alternative commemorations, which again tried to portray an alternative message. They even started building their own alternative monuments, and they managed to build in 1983, 2 years after the Bulgarian anniversary events, a monument of the victims of totalitarianism in Bulgaria on the outskirts of Toronto, Canada, where there was a massive anti-communist gathering of Bulgarian émigrés trying to portray this alternative message. So you ultimately, what you ultimately see that one of the effects of these Bulgarian cultural policies was to mobilize the anti-communist immigration and to try to organize them in a way, and to actually organize them in a way in which they tried to represent, to enunciate an alternative message to the official policies carried out by the communist regime in Bulgaria. So this is just one example of what the reactions of the audiences were and what the tricky line the official policies were really following. And then another very unlikely, perhaps, success case was Austria, but I'm not going to talk about this here. I just want to wrap up with what I began. That whole idea of a cultural opening. Recently, there were events in Bulgaria. There were various manifestations of a trend among some intellectuals, among some academics even, to interpret these events that I am discussing as a form of a Bulgarian cultural opening, kulturno otvaranje. This is really the term that was used. Some of these events occurred on occasion of the celebration of the 70th anniversary since the birth of Ludmila Živkova, and her daughter, Evgenia Živkova, pictured over there in the red dress, participated in a number of events, from exhibitions in the National Gallery of Foreign Art, part of which this collage is, to academic conferences at the University of Sofia discussing the heritage of her mother. Some of these events drew loud protests coming from the right and disputing what they saw as the surreptitious rehabilitation of communist elites and the attempt to erase the dark history of communism in Bulgaria and to create a glorious picture for the Živkov clan in particular and Ludmila Živkova specifically. So there were very strong reactions both on the left and on the right on occasion of this anniversary of Ludmila Živkova, and a debate began at all. Now, of course, all of these conversations are connected to the memory wars in contemporary post-socialist Bulgaria. Ludmila Živkova seems to be eliciting very strong reactions. On the one hand, you you have those who criticize her policies as an attempt to create a local intellectual nomenclatura loyal to the regime, and basically by bribing these intellectuals, killing any attempt at the creation of a dissident movement in Bulgaria. Now, the theory here is very interesting. It goes like this. Because Ludmila provided all of these material resources, she basically bought the intellectuals. And therefore, Bulgaria has no dissidents, or very few dissidents, because they were given the opportunity to engage in all of these cultural events. Therefore, there was no need for them to protest. There was no need for them to get out of the way to ask for something that they were given. They simply had to show loyalty, and they had all the material resources that they needed to do their art, to publish their works, to show their works overseas. So that's the critical view. But of course, you actually have, in the climate of post-socialist nostalgia, you have a very pronounced movement towards the rehabilitation of Ludmila Živkova, portraying her sometimes as the first dissident, almost, in Bulgaria, as the person who spoke against the Soviet Union in some ways, as the person who managed to create an alternative cultural space, who showcased Bulgaria to the world. Now, these are very tricky questions to answer, because if we are going to talk about a Bulgarian cultural opening abroad, we cannot possibly just focus on one specific group of individuals, namely intellectuals, who, yes, indeed, were given the opportunity to travel extensively abroad. We also have to ask ourselves, well, what were the opportunities in front of the ordinary Bulgarian? What were the tourism trends? Were ordinary Bulgarians able to travel to these international events and view for themselves these achievements of Bulgarian art and culture? And there, the answer is clearly no. Bulgarians could not travel. They had very limited abilities to travel, which actually are unprecedented in the Soviet bloc, because all other socialist countries, minus the GDR possibly, traveled more extensively than the Bulgarians did during this time period. So we really need to see the studies of tourism, the studies of Bulgarians traveling. There were very few cases of political immigration for that reason, because they were simply unable to get overseas to request political asylum in Western Europe and the rest of the world. And it's very clear that Bulgaria remains a closed society during this time period as far as opportunities to travel internationally. And one final remark that I wish to make is that also the events were perceived, these events associated with the cultural opening, with this cultural penetration, to use the appropriate term from the 1970s, were perceived differently internationally and domestically. We don't have cumulative data, but it's very likely that ordinary Bulgarians were resentful of the possibilities of these cultural elites to travel extensively, whereas they could not reunite with their families, they could not travel, they could not experience all of these opportunities, but they only read of these opportunities in the newspapers. Still, the legacy of Ludmila Živkova is going to continue to be debated, because I think what happened is that the national message, or rather the nationalist message, I believe ultimately worked. The nationalism associated with these celebrations ultimately created this national feeling that Ludmila had indeed managed to achieve the second golden age of Bulgarian culture. And I was truly shocked just a month ago when the Facebook group Memories from the People's Republic posted a photograph of Ludmila Živkova, to read throughout the posts and to actually see that they were overwhelmingly positive. They were overwhelmingly emphasizing her role as a Bulgarian cultural ambassador, as someone who managed to basically showcase Bulgaria abroad. Some of them recognized her origins and her political connections, but that did not seem to prevent them from commenting on the achievements in their mind that Ludmila had in establishing an international reputation for Bulgaria. So I think that these debates should continue, or what we spoke about at the beginning of this talk, this need to actually study the communist past seems to be really important and really acute in Bulgaria, because the lack of knowledge of the extent of the function of the rationale behind policies initiated by Ludmila and her close associates is something that still needs to be studied by historians and disseminated to the broader audience. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture, and we'll open for questions. Yes,
I have several. Thank you very much. It is amazing to see the difference between the scholarship done in Bulgaria about Ludmila Živkova and what you have done. And because I'm an advocate of total, how to say, negation of, not total, but I'm very hard critique of Ludmila. I would like to ask you a couple of questions. Of course, with the remark that we cannot underestimate some of the intended or unintended effects of partly of her cultural policy. And here I will say something immediate about, I like very much the way you describe the ideas behind her, I mean, her philosophy and so on and so forth. But I'm sharing some of my research with you and some of the things that I accumulated as both oral history and some documental proofs. I doubt that Ludmila was capable of creating, of actually creating the whole philosophy and the scope of this program. The mastermind behind her was Alexander Folk. I was his student. He became, he was his favorite teacher, and all the documentation shows that he was the architect of the idea behind the celebration of the 13th century Bulgaria. He was surely the one who created the whole Institute of Thracian Studies and the huge propaganda of the Thracian art. Then a second historian, Güzelev, was the one behind the medieval Bulgarian exhibition, and so on and so forth. So she had around her a circle of very well-educated people. All of them, now we know that were agents of the secret police. I don't know about, for sure, Bogomil and Fol and Güzelev, and I don't know about Svetlin Rusev. But all possible, how to say, deviations in this structure, this new, how to say, program, were, I would say, I guess, not only monitored by the secret police in Bulgaria, but actually were part of their secret operations. And I'll give one striking example which came out recently. Maybe you have heard that for 7 years the secret police, under the surveillance of Ludmila was organizing the theft of Paisi's history from the monastery of Hilandar. So everything was organized, well paid, prepared, sending agents, etc., etc. So I think that this is a very, very, very important example which gives, which shows the whole scope and actually the tremendous hypocrisy of this cultural policy. And there are many, many other questions. Maybe I'll talk to you another time. But my other question was about Yes, her Agni Yoga, her devotion to Agni Yoga. Being Agni Yoga, she traveled every second week with the state plane to India. Her last speeches are completely incomprehensible and crazy. They are crazy. I mean, I have studied them very carefully, and I'm sure you did the same. So I doubt about. I mean, this internal ambiguity and internal struggle, if you wish, that she probably encountered between, say, if how honest she was being a yoga, I don't know, but surely she saw some of the, say, Soviet Union terror on Bulgaria as impossible to bear anymore. But again, she was extremely devoted to her father, to all the nonsense that he wrote in 40 volumes. She never tried to and opened any kind of door for dissident or anti-communist, say, even debate. Thus, I think that she's over-glorified, and I doubt about her sincere intentions.
And Mark?
Yeah, I'd like to go down a different track. I think that Ludmila was more of an occult, more of a mystic, and that much of what she was doing was essentially more in the style of Madame Blavatsky in terms of the way in which she looked at the world. Now, at the same time, I do agree with Evelina that Alexander Fall was the brains behind the whole issue. Fall had a conceptualization. You have to remember also that this is the time when the Paleo-Balkan peoples, as such, is a very important archaeological issue. And the questions then of ethnogenesis, the questions of who belongs to where and to whom, the question of the role of the Macedonian language, and that's why Bulgaria is not in the International Linguistic Atlas, because of their relationship with the International Linguistic Association. So there's a lot going on. One of the things that they were trying to do was to show some kind of a continuity. And the continuity was Thracian. And people still today will say to you that they are somehow related. There's some kind of Thracian relationship between the Franks from Varna and other groups, which is really untrue. That doesn't work. But I do think that certainly through Ludmila's, how can I say, through her own emphasis, she brought Bulgaria to the face of the world, because nobody knew about it before. Bulgaria was a closed entity, and now everybody knew about it. So there is a certain amount of kudos that I do believe belongs to her in terms of some of the things that she was doing. I'm not discussing her political agenda or whatever, but I do think she also was in a very, very difficult position for where she was. She studied at Oxford. She had seen many things. All right. So there were lots of intellectual conflicts that were part of her whole personality. But this was a rather unique way of bringing the situation forth.
I may also, it's a question that I don't expect you to answer because it's in a totally different discipline, but I would be curious to match these cultural policies to economic policies at the time and see whether this cultural diplomacy is related to deepening economic crisis and stagnation, Zhivkov's idea for innovation and stealing Western technology and sci-fi, not sci-fi, but scientific advancement, right? The scientific revolution, and also to the early establishment of these joint ventures. Because if indeed, certainly cultural diplomacy is not happening in isolation, if this indeed has this also hidden agenda of doing that, this would perfectly explain why ideologically all of this was toned down in the West, because it tries to attract investors, tries to attract a number of other things that you know, would not go and fly well at the Soviet Union, which is why the celebration of the Soviet Union was very good.
Shall I maybe respond to some of this and yeah, or if you wish.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much. These are, I mean, these are more comments than questions, and they really allow me to think about different aspects of this study. I perhaps shouldn't have ended this presentation with the picture of Ludmila. I probably should go back right here, maybe, to this more, oh, I guess it's Ludmila again, but it's not the Facebook glorification of Ludmila. Well, I actually am trying very hard in my study not to turn it into a prosopography of Ludmila. Or any of these communist elites, because I honestly don't want to write about the architects of these policies. I want to talk about cultural diplomacy, about what its role was in the context of détente, in the context of the human rights discussion that was happening during this time period. I want to talk about what happens to communist ideas when they cross borders. And I want to talk about implementation and reactions of the audience. First of all, when I study these issues in the US academic context, I cannot really focus too much on personalities because I lose my audiences. Very few people in the United States know who Ludmila Živkova is. So I cannot possibly frame this study around the person of Ludmila Živkova. On the other hand, it's a very important question. We do need to sort of like deal with the whole issue of the role of these elites. So I really want to thank both Evelina and Mark for raising this issue of the role of Ludmila. I just came back from the UK National Archives, and I came across this report of the Foreign Office from 1980, entitled Important Personalities in Bulgaria in 1980. And I was really struck to see whom they included in the most important personalities in Bulgaria. Of course, everyone who was part of the State Council and the Politburo was there. However, Alexander Fall was part of it. Lubomir Dalchev. Who else? Kosev, academic Kosev, the historian. Pantelei Zarev, the other academician of literature. So you really see Svetlin Rusev was also part of it, right? So you really see how these intellectuals who were so instrumental in the conception, and I totally agree, that they're the ones who actually put these things in practice and conceptualize them, how important they were in what the West perceived to be the important people in Bulgaria.
They were all given very high positions.
Absolutely.
So they are part of the, how to say, of
the cultural nomenclatura.
Yes.
Yes.
So obviously, the British are going to list the high officials and their high officials. They are not intellectuals in this case.
Well, I mean, I see your point. They're not intellectuals because they occupy state positions. Yes.
You don't
yes.
writers or poets coming from,
of course,
Konstantin Pavlov
yes.
or Neron or something else. I mean,
of course.
They are listed there because of their capacity of state functionaries.
Exactly, and formulating policy, absolutely. But I mean, what I was really struck is actually how important the cultural sector was, right? In the evaluation of who the important people in Bulgaria were. Because why include these people in the list of most important personalities if culture is not seen as important, right? So to me...
Who else would you include?
Well, all of the other state functionaries in the various ministries, in the various economic councils, they include it as well.
They were also intellectuals in their own field.
Yes.
And I'm saying that's something that is not the same, for example, in the States. You don't have that crossover.
Sure.
So here you have a very limited corpus of individuals, and you just draw from that, and that's what becomes part of the whole state the state policy. So there is that symbiosis between the two.
I absolutely do not dispute that. What I guess I'm trying to emphasize is this renewed importance of culture that, I mean, culture becomes important again.
This was the only thing that Bulgaria could have exported, for God's sake. Bulgaria had nothing.
And tomatoes, the largest exporter of tomatoes after Italy.
They were very simple. They said clearly, we don't have anything for export but culture. Then make up culture. This is what they said, and they did it.
Okay, I mean, yes, I don't dispute that.
This is actually a question. unlike the questions of some of my colleagues. Does it occur to you, I mean, I'm sure it does, but the very choice of celebrating the birth of a formation of a pre-capitalist state, particularly with all the ethnographic issues that are surrounding, particularly that would likely to trample on feelings of some of the fellow socialist states. Is an odd choice of something to arrange a national campaign around? I mean, it's something that is almost certainly going to be divisive among your allies, and to sell it to the Western world, I mean, intentionally or not, I mean, I have no idea what people's intentions were, but just the logic of events, if you want your event in New York to be successful, you want to show people things that they want to see. So, yeah, what do they want to see? They don't want to hear ideology. They want to see, you know, fancy gold statues and stuff like that. So that's what you show them. It seems to be leading in a direction that is not ideologically useful or coherent. And I can't wrap my mind around what the whole purpose of this was.
Yeah, just one other thing. Bulgaria was not unique in terms of having celebrations of 1,300 years.
That's it.
You had them for Yugoslavia, you had them for Albania, and each country has devoted a lot of money to the development of their archaeology, for example.
That's it.
It's archaeology's greatest benefit, if you want. But that was the whole Illyrian question.
Absolutely.
The question in former Yugoslavia, the question in Romania. Each of these countries was trying to, it's kind of like, me too. I have a history, so therefore, you go back and you go back as you can go, as far as you can go. And along the way, Bulgaria had some beautiful things that were showcase pieces.
Yeah.
And every time you had a cultural manifestation for Bulgaria, it starts with the Varna necropolis.
That's right.
That's where it starts with.
Yeah.
Although that has absolutely nothing to do with the Thracians, it's still the part of the well, it's the part of the line, if you want.
Well,
And one of the problems, also, just one last thing is, problem is that ideologically, they really didn't know how to ascertain the problems of the socialist state. In other words, how do you justify, okay, the existence of, let's say, during the Neolithic, of a particular period? Well, we have grinding stones. If we have grinding stones, we have agriculture, we have exploitation, because there's something left over. So then the question of surplus becomes very big. What I'm saying is there are many, many issues here that impinge on this kind of trying to understand, trying to use the socialist economy, which just didn't work.
I also wonder to what extent was this the type of the caprice of the queen, that she was in a position to use state resources for whatever ambitions, realistic or unrealistic, and her attempt to emancipate herself from her father.
That's right.
So you have a lot of psychological issues.
That's right.
I believe
That's
on
right.
top of that. That she knew she would be granted that much freedom and that she could go in that direction without, sanctioning and sort of to carve a lane for herself. So in many ways, this could also be seen as very egocentric.
Oh, it was definitely a case of nepotism, right? I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that that's the case. And I mean, I think she makes these comments in her personal correspondence in her writings, that, she's always going to be seen as the daughter of Fyodor Zhivkov, whatever she does, whether she does it right or she does it wrong. Now, there is someone actually writing currently a dissertation called Occult Communism, who specifically examines her fascination with the occult. So that's why actually I'm not going to touch upon this thing. So this person is going to be writing about Ludmila, and I'm trying not to, because I just really don't feel like engaging in these things. As a historian of institutions and social and cultural practices, I'm actually more interested in the practices. Now, there's no doubt that what you are describing in terms of why choose to celebrate this ancient history, right? This pre-state formation, the history of these pre-state formations, pre-Bulgarian state formations. Well, that's clearly part of the whole nationalist agenda. Archaeology has been part of the national project of every state in Europe since its establishment. Whether it will be, Britain, whether it will be Greece, whether it will be Germany. Archaeology is what also justifies the continuity of the nation with, since ancient times. Now, in the Bulgarian case, it's very clear that the link to the Thracians is not the invention of Alexander Fall. That is something that he codified, he did institutionalize, he did make sure it became part of the school curriculum. But since the interwar period, there were intellectuals in Bulgaria who looked back in time, looking for traces of ancient civilizations in Bulgaria, looking for the Thracians in order to show that the Thracians were the pre-Greek population in Bulgaria, because this is where the dispute is. And that was very clear for me when I was doing my first book on the Greeks in Bulgaria, how the whole idea of the Thracians came up during this nationalist debate between Bulgarians and Greeks from the late 19th century, early 20th century in the interwar period. Very clearly, the resurgence of nationalism under Zhivkov and Ludmila capitalizes on these prior ideas. So, and the only appeal here is the national or nationalist appeal. It is total manipulation of the past. Yes, the Thracians have nothing to do with the Bulgarians, but the ancient Greeks have nothing to do with the contemporary Greeks.
Try to say this in Greece.
Exactly, right? Or the Romans and the Italians, or anything else, right? We can find thousands of examples here of how the past is used to legitimize the present. So there's not anything unique that the Bulgarians are doing here.
It just seems like a project that could so easily go off the rails. If you're celebrating, this proto-nationalism by a regime that's supposedly this internationalist brotherhood of fellow socialists, the more successful the celebration is, the more you're going to be spinning out.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
May I just ask, do you know some numbers about the cost of
No.
No.
I don't think it will be easy to find those numbers. I have seen examples, so the financial question, I've seen examples of lavish spending. There's no doubt that it was done in an extremely extravagant way. I've seen the content of the suitcase of Robert Maxwell. So that's something, right? The publisher of Fyodor Zhivkov in the West. I've seen what the gift suitcase that they gave him on occasion of 1300 years contains, and it's full of golden, basically commemorative coins. Yes. But that is just one drop in a huge ocean.
Those 38,000 events, my mind boggles at that.
Exactly.
Some of them must have been
Double counting.
not tremendously impressive,
You're absolutely right.
Poetry reading or something somewhere.
Exactly.
Okay.
Some of them were completely not impressive at all. However, reporting is extremely important for a communist state where you have a controlled, cultural sector. Well, so if you get 5 people in an embassy to read Bulgarian poetry, you're going to report it and count it as an event.
Okay.
Yes. But you should agree that, I mean, we have a very nice event here of 10 people, and I think this should count as an event as well. So this is what the Bulgarians are counting.
Well, we'll count this event in our report.
Aha!
I already
Theodora, and thank you for the wonderful discussion.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
This program is brought to you by AUBG Talks. For more, please visit us at aubg.edu/talks.